Alrighty, in this video I want to show you guys how we can go about creating a enemy spawner that will spawn out an enemy, and that enemy will take advantage of the character controller we've already written to do its movement. In addition, we also want to handle the ability for that enemy to respawn when he dies, or when you die, before you've reached the next checkpoint. So this should be pretty straightforward. We're just going to bring in our fish guy, we're going to throw a couple scripts on him, and then we're going to write a really basic AI script. Okay, well, let's start with writing the really basic AI script, because this is going to be pretty straightforward. I'm going to come back up here into our Visual Studio, and then in my code folder, I'm going to add a new class, and I'm going to call this Simple Enemy AI. So Simple Enemy AI. Take off the namespace definition, have this inherit from mono behavior. That'll bring in using Unity Engine at the top. What kind of parameters does he need? Well, first of all, he's going to need a public float speed, how fast he goes. Then he's going to need a public float fire rate, and let's set that fire rate to 1. And then he's going to need a public projectile. What projectile does he spawn when he decides to shoot the player? And then that's really all we'll need for our public data, the speed, the fire rate, and projectile. Like I said, this guy's going to be pretty simple. Then I'm going to go ahead and write some private variables. I'm going to write a private character controller 2D underscore controller that'll be responsible for having this player interact with our platforms. Then I need a private vector2 direction, which is the direction he's moving in. Basically, when he hits an edge of the level, I want him to basically flip and turn around. Then after we have the direction, let's go ahead and keep track of his initial position. So I'm going to say private vector2 start position. Why am I doing this? Well, like I said, this object is going to need to be respawned when the player dies before hitting the next checkpoint. So we need to keep track of where he started. We'll also need to keep track of his fire rate. So I'll say private float can fire in. So you'll notice that this is looking very similar to our player. In addition, I know that I'll have a particle effect for when he dies, so I'm going to add another public game object destroyed effect that'll be spawned when he dies. Now, before we go and we actually write out his methods, which he'll only have a couple of them, he needs to implement a couple interfaces. He needs to implement iTakeDamage and iPlayerRespawnListener. By implementing the iTakeDamage, he can respond to being hit by a player projectile, and by implementing iPlayerRespawnListener, he can respond when the player gets reinstantiated. So let's go ahead and implement those two methods. The two methods that will be forced to implement by implementing these two interfaces are takedamage and onPlayerRespawn in this checkpoint. Then, in addition to these two methods, I'm going to need to write a public void start method, and I'm going to have to write a public void update method. Okay, all his start method is going to do is it's going to alias out the controller that is also going to be added to this game object. So I'll say underscore controller equals get component character controller 2D. So we'll do that. Then I'm going to say direction equals new vector2 1 0, saying that he's moving to the right. We'll initialize him moving to the right. Or let's go ahead and say negative 1 0. So we'll initialize him moving to the left. I think that makes a little bit more sense. Then we'll keep track of his start position by saying start position equals transform dot position. Okay, so his update method, all we'll do is we'll say controller dot set horizontal force to direction.x times speed. Then we need to see if he's colliding with the left or with the right, in which case we will reverse his direction. So I'm going to say if direction.x is smaller than 0, meaning he's moving to the left, and controller.state.is colliding left, meaning he hit a left wall, or he's moving to the right, in which case his direction.x will be greater than 0, and controller state is colliding right, which means he hit a right wall, then we want to do two things. I want to say direction equals negative direction. That'll reverse the direction that he's moving. And then I also want to say transform.localScale equals new vector 3 minus transform local scale x, transform local scale y, transform local scale z. So this will reverse him. Okay, so after we do this, we need to see if he needs to shoot anything. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say if can fire in minus equals time dot delta time is greater than 0, then return. So that means that at this point he can't fire yet, so there's nothing else for him to do. Then I want to do a raycast to see if the player is in his vision, basically. So I want to do a raycast to his left or to his right, which will indicate if the player is able to be hit by this object. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say var raycast equals physics 2D dot raycast. The origin is transform.position. The direction is going to be our underscore direction. The distance, let's just arbitrarily place 10 in here. Then I want to pass in a layer mask, and this layer mask is going to indicate if this object that we raycast against is the player or not, or is something that we want to respond to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say the layer mask is going to be 1 left shift layer mask dot name to layer player. Now we haven't created the player layer yet, but we will here shortly. Then I wanted to say if not raycast, then return. So that means the player is not in his line of sight. So then we don't want to do anything else. Then what I want to do is I want to instantiate my projectile. So I'm going to say var projectile equals cast to projectile, instantiate projectile at our transform.position and our transform.rotation. Then I want to say projectile.initialize, passing in game object as the owner, direction as the direction, and our initial velocity of controller.velocity. Finally, I want to set can fire in equals fire rate. Okay, so there's a couple of things. There's a couple of things that we could do to make this better. We could add in a transform of the position that we want to shoot that projectile in, like we did with the player, and so on. But I'm just going to leave this be as it is for now, because this is just a really simple, basic AI. Now, what happens when we take damage? Well, what I want to happen is I simply want this game object to disappear. But I don't want to destroy the game object. The reason I don't want to destroy him is because when the player respawns, I want to reset this object to wherever he was when he started being alive. So what I'm going to do on take damage is I'm going to, first of all, I'm going to instantiate the destroy effect. Then I'm going to say game object dot set active false, which will deactivate this game object. Finally, on player respawn in this checkpoint, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the direction to new vector 2 -1 0, setting his direction properly. I'm going to set his transform local scale to new vector 3 1 1 1, so that he's facing the proper direction. Then I want to set his transform.position to start position. And then finally I want to set game object set active equals true. So this happens when the player respawns in this checkpoint. He will move back to where he was before, become reactivated, and set his direction appropriately. Alright, so that's our simple enemy AI. Let's go ahead and put him together inside of Unity. So the first thing I gotta do is, let's start off by creating his destroyed effect. So I'm going to come up to prefabs, effects. I'm going to take a small, because he's a red guy, right? So I'm going to take a small red burst. I'm going to come up here. I'm going to say game object break prefab instance. I'm going to rename this to large red burst. I'm going to change the size of my red burst to maybe 4. That's actually a really cool imploding effect. Let's overlay. I'm going to come up here and I'm going to delete this guy in a second, but I'm going to overlay the bad fish on there so I can play around with the particle effect and see how that looks in the context of him. So let's set the start size to maybe 7? No, maybe 5? I think that looks good. So that's a good size. I'm going to go ahead and delete the red guy again so that we're just working with our particle effect. Then I'm maybe going to change the color over lifetime and change the end color to maybe something a little bit more saturated. There we go. I think that looks pretty good for our large red burst. So let's go ahead and turn it into a prefab. I'm going to click and drag on prefabs, and I'm going to drop this in effects for our large red burst. There's a couple more things we got to do. We definitely need to make a new projectile. Remember, we have our microphone of mass destruction, but and we have our path projectile red saw, but we don't have an object that inherits from projectile that the enemy can shoot that isn't a microphone. So let's go ahead and create that projectile. I'm going to scroll back down to my texture atlas main, and I'm going to drag out a red saw. So that's going to be the thing that he shoots. For the red saw, all I'm going to do is I'm going to add in my circle collider 2D, set is trigger to true. After my circle collider, I need to add in my rigid body 2D and make sure it's kinematic so that the collision detection will work properly with an object that's moving. Then I want to add my simple projectile script. Simple projectile script, let's give it a speed of 7. Let's give it a collision mask with platforms and projectiles. And we also want to add a collision mask to include the player because we want this to be able to hit the player. But we don't have that layer yet, and we haven't set up the player to have that layer. So let's go ahead and go to our layers dropdown, say edit layers, and let's add in a player layer. Now that we have that layer, we'll click on our buzzsaw, scroll all the way down to our simple projectile, and add that to our collision mask, our player layer. Damage, let's have it give 15 damage. Destroyed effect. Let's just go ahead and let's do a small red burst for our destroyed effect. Points to give player if he kills it, let's give it to 10. And the time to live, let's give it a time to live of 10. Alright, so let's rename this red saw game object to red saw projectile. And let's prefabify it by dropping it into our projectiles folder. And now we have our red saw projectile. Okay, the last thing we need to do is actually create our enemy. So I'm going to go into textures, I'm going to go into texture atlas main, and I'm going to drop in our bad fish. Then on our bad fish, we need to add a couple things. For my, first of all, I need it to be in a layer that can be hit by projectiles. So let's go ahead and add another layer into our game. And I'm going to call this layer enemies. And we'll use this layer to mark enemies in our game that can be hit by projectiles. Then I'm going to say on his layer, I'm going to come up here and add him to enemies. Then I'm going to add a component. I'm going to need a rigid body 2D, and it's going to be needed to be kinematic. I'm going to need a box collider 2D, which I'm going to modify the box collider to not include his spikes. So we're mostly just going to include that. I think that's a good enough approximation for what I want. We're going to set is trigger to true. Next up, we need a character controller 2D on him. So we're going to open up character controller 2D. We're going to leave all these parameters the exact same. Of course, we're going to set the platform mask to platforms. Now that we have our character controller 2D, we're going to add our simple enemy AI. We're going to set him to have a speed of, let's say, 9 and a fire rate of 1. Now we need to give him a projectile and a destroyed effect. His destroyed effect will be large burst, and his projectile will be red saw projectile. And that's really all we need for this guy. So let's go ahead and turn him into a prefab. So I'm going to go up to prefabs. I'm going to add a new folder called enemies. And then I'm going to click and drag bad fish over into our enemies folder. In addition, I also want this enemy to result in the player losing health if he hits the enemy. So I'm going to add a new component called give damage to player. And I'm going to say damage to give 25 because there's a huge spiky red dude. If you hit that guy, then you're doing something wrong. Now that I've done that, I'm going to scroll all the way back to the top and hit apply so his prefab is applied. Alrighty, so now let's go ahead and place him. I'm going to place him, I'm going to add a new bit of code or a new bit of gameplay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete these punji sticks. I'm going to take this grass and I'm going to duplicate it by hitting Control D and I'm going to move it over. Then I'm going to take this grass and delete it, and I'm going to copy both of these dirtfuls. I'm going to duplicate them. I'm going to move it over here. And then I'm going to take the checkpoint and move it over here, right on this star. And I don't want the checkpoint to be on a star, so I'm going to move the star up there and move the checkpoint right there. Then for the enemy, I'm going to place him all the way over here so that he'll run forward, fall down because of gravity, and then he'll sit there and run back and forth, kind of like a Goomba. Alrighty, now that we have all that stuff done, we have a couple more changes to make. First of all, I have to come up here to the player and make sure that the player is on the player layer. And then I'm going to, let's go ahead and just know this object only for the player. And then I'm going to hit apply to apply that change to all the prefabs. Then I'm going to go into my projectiles and ensure that I have everything set up. My microphone of mass destruction, I want to be able to hit this enemy. So the collision mask is I'm going to set up to enemies. And then the red saw projectile, let's see, platforms, projectiles, and player. Okay, that's what I want. And I think that pretty much wraps up all we need to do to get this simple enemy AI working. So let's hit play and see what happens. Check that out. Let's see if he shoots me. And he does shoot me. I do take 25 damage if I hit him. And when I destroyed him, he didn't have quite the effect that I wanted. Let's see that again. Actually, I'm going to come back here. I'm going to make his little playground area a little bit bigger by deleting this grass, moving these two bits of grass and him, which I can't do. I'll just have to move these two bits of grass first, or these two bits of dirt. And then I'm going to move him over to the right, and then I'm going to duplicate this dirt and create another one. And now let's hit play. This should give us a better way of testing this enemy. So he does shoot those projectiles. Let's see if those projectiles hurt me. They don't hurt me. So let's see what's going on there. I'm going to close out of that. Actually, I know exactly what's going on. What's going on is we never told the player that he needs to take damage from projectiles. We never had the player implement the I take damage interface. So when projectiles hit him, they don't apply damage to him. So let's go ahead and fix that. Let's open up Visual Studio and come over here to our player. And let's have our player implement the I take damage interface. Now, I'm not going to have this method implemented because we actually already have a method in the player that takes damage, except for it doesn't have the second parameter. And because it doesn't have the second parameter, it's not going to fulfill this interface. So to fix that, we need to scroll down to the take damage method on our player, and we need to add a new parameter. I'm going to add a new parameter of GameObjectInstigator. Now that we've done that, it fulfills the interface, and our player can now take damage from enemy projectiles. So coming back into Unity and hitting play, let's test that. We have an error. We have an error because we also invoked the player.takeDamage from our giveDamageToPlayer method. We can correct this error simply by satisfying the second parameter by passing in the game object that the giveDamageToPlayer script was attached to. Alright, coming back into Unity and hitting play, we should now be able to take damage from those buzzsaws. So let's see. And indeed we do take damage. So let's go ahead and see why our enemy isn't playing the right destroyed effect. If we open up our enemy and go down to his destroyed effect, we see that it is large red burst, which should be the effect that gets played. But unfortunately, it's not the effect that's playing. Our large red burst is not the effect that's being played when the enemy is destroyed. So let's come back into Visual Studio. Let's open up our simple enemy AI, and let's see that our destroyed effect, oh wow. We're instantiating our destroyed effect, but we're not placing it where the enemy was. So that's going to be problematic. Let's go and do that. I'm going to set transform.position and transform.rotation to this instantiate call. So now coming back into Unity and hitting play, we do indeed destroy the enemy. But what happens if we die after killing the enemy? So let's go over here and die. And then let's come back and we see the enemy is actually respawned exactly where he was when he was initially placed. Alrighty. So that's actually pretty cool. Let's come back and test a couple more things. I want to make sure that we're receiving points for destroying the enemy's projectile, and then I also want the ability to receive points for destroying the enemy himself. That was not a good test because I didn't actually destroy one of his projectiles. Let's wait for him to shoot. Okay, I don't think we received any points from shooting that projectile. So let's fix that. Let's go into our projectiles, our red saw projectile, and we see that we do have points give to player 10. So are we receiving points and just not seeing it? So we have points 30 right now, and if we destroy this projectile, we still have points 30. So that's clearly not what we want. Let's wait for one of these projectiles gets instantiated. Let's pause the game and check to see that points to give player is still 10. So clearly we have an issue, and I think the issue that we have is that we're running into a slight race condition here. So coming back into Visual Studio and opening up our simple projectile, we see that we have points to give player, and we're using it right here. Points to give player is not equal 0. Extract the projectile. If the projectile does not equal null and get player does not equal null, then do that. Let's go ahead and debug log out this take damage method. Debug log out points to give plus instigator.name. Then let's come back into Unity. I think we have a race condition going on with our collision detection. I think since those two objects are colliding at the exact same time, we see that we hit red saw projectile is the instigator, microphone of mass destruction is the instigator, points given is both 0. So the red saw projectile, what's happening here is the projectile is getting destroyed. The red saw projectile is destroying the... Well, no, the red saw projectile is destroying the microphone of mass destruction. No, the microphone of mass destruction is destroying the red saw... Something's going on. Let's add some more debugging logic in here. I'm going to say instigator name, and then I'm going to show the game object name. So we see, well, let's go ahead and let's clear that out and do that one more time. Okay, so the red saw projectile, or the microphone of mass destruction, is getting hit by the red saw projectile, destroying the microphone of mass destruction. And I think when you destroy the microphone of mass destruction, it's not going to trigger the give points to player. Let's test that. Let's test that by not destroying the projectiles at all. Coming back here and hitting play, by not destroying the projectiles, we'll be able to see if we are indeed running into a slight race condition. And I don't think we are. The reason I don't think we are is we didn't destroy those projectiles, yet they did disappear without the proper log coming out to indicate that that message was received by the other object. So I think what might be going on here is our red saw projectile is not on the projectiles layer. The red saw projectile is not on the projectiles layer and therefore is not being processed by the microphone. So let's go ahead and set the layer, the red saw projectile, to projectiles. And then let's see what happens. There we go. Now you see that we get 10 points when we destroy this projectile. Okay, but we still don't get any points when we kill the enemy. So let's go ahead and fix that. To fix that, pretty straightforward. Let's just jump into the simple enemy AI. Let's find his take damage method. At the beginning of the take damage method, we need to identify if we got damage from a projectile that was shot by the player. If we do, we want to add points to the player. So I'm going to say if points to give player does not equal 0, then var projectile equals instigator get component projectile. If projectile does not equal null and projectile.owner.get component player does not equal null, then we want to say game manager instance add points to give player. Then we want to say floating text dot show string format plus placeholder points to give player, passing in a style of what do we call that? Point star text, and then passing in a positioner of from world point text positioner camera main transform dot position time to live 1.5 seconds float or speed 50 points or 50 pixels a second. Now this logic has been repeated quite a few times in our application, and as an added as a challenge, I guess as a question to you guys, it would be interesting to see the ways in which that we could make this code a lot more extendable and more reusable so that we don't have to repeat it all over our project. But for now, I'll leave it as it is. Now you'll notice that I've been writing this code against a field that doesn't yet exist. So let's go ahead and add the points to give player at the top of this file. So I'm going to scroll all the way to the top, and I'm going to say public int points to give player, and that's it. Now that I've done that, let's jump back into Unity, hit play. Or sorry, the first thing we want to do is click on this enemy and find his points to give player, which is right here on his simple enemy AI script, and let's give the player 50 points if he kills this enemy. Let's hit start. And we do indeed get 50 points. Alrighty. Now, there was one more thing I wanted to do, wasn't there? Oh yeah, we need to get rid of that debug log out of the simple projectile script. I'm going to remove this debug log out because we don't need it anymore. We used it to debug that issue, and I hope you guys found that process a little bit useful for how to debug an issue like that. But now we no longer need that debug statement. So I think that pretty much wraps up our dumb enemy. He could be a lot more interesting. There's a lot of room for extensibility and additional logic that we could place in here. But I just kind of wanted to show you guys how we could use all of the stuff we've already built in order to construct a simple AI. You'll notice that at this particular time in the series, what we're doing is no longer really creating these big, huge monolithic systems, as much as we're just taking all the stuff we've already written and we're starting to use it in different ways to create more interesting results. So I hope that really shows you guys the power of component-based programming and Unity's model of using game objects. Anyway, we'll see you guys in the next video.